All right, so we'll say good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Shevat. Mrs. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all of the Sherman Drashos this month in memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kálman, Eliעזר, Halevi. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. We thank Avi Tobias for his TALMUD Torah sponsorship as well for the month of Shvat. Again, in the schus of the shir, and in appreciation to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful Torah. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Jacob and Eli Kates, in commemoration of the yahrtzeit of Jacob's grandfather, Yissochor Dov Ben Meir, on Yud Zayin Shevat. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And also with that, let us begin. Oh, it looks like we're frozen over here, or maybe not. Okay, well, so with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Daf Zayin. We are picking up on Vav Amud Beis. We actually have a lot to do today. We kind of left off in the middle of Vav Amud Beis of 6b, and we left off with Amar Rabbeinu. We actually read this, but let's just pick up here again. This will go quickly. So we'll say, so remember, I get about 26 lines up from the bottom. So Amar Rabbeinu. So Rabbeinu says as follows, Shema Mino, Hai Tarbitza Shar Le Tarbutze B'Chala Demoada. So also remember again, we left off with this. Tarbitza, Rashi says, is a gina, is a garden. So what we see again from what the Gemara stated regarding the Sadeh grid. So we'll say the Sadeh grid is a field that is naturally dry, but yet that one is permitted to go ahead and water on Chalamayid. So the Gemara says, Ravina said, you see from here that this tarbitza, this garden patch, shari letarbutze b'chala demod, you can sprinkle water on it, right? You can sprinkle water on it on Chalamayid. So the Gemara says, now where do you see that from? So Sadeh grid, some grid, my taima. Why is it that you're permitted to go ahead and water a Sadeh grid? Mishum, the Gemara says, da'afla mashri lecharfa. Because what you do is you take crops that would normally go ahead and sprout later, and because now you're watering it, ultimately they'll sprout earlier. Hachinami, so too in the garden patch, afla mashvila charfa. You take again things that once again sprout later and cause them to sprout earlier. So we'll say, in other words, what the Gemara is developing over here is something very interesting. That up until now we've been focusing on the idea of loss, right? Of hefsid meruba. Now the Gemara also introduces us to the idea that if there's the possibility to potentially accelerate growth and the possibility to go ahead and cause things which would sprout later to sprout earlier, that may be mutter as well. Tanrabanon marbitzin sadeh lavan b'shviyas avalo b'moed. The notion of marbitzin is to sprinkle water. Sprinkling water is not a full-fledged watering, but it's really just to moisten the soil and moisten the crops. So one is permitted to go ahead and moisten a sadeh lav on a grain field on Shemitah, but not on Chalamayid. But we learned elsewhere that you're permitted to go ahead and, or call it sprinkle, the field both on Chalamayid as well as on Shemitah. It's not a contradiction. Ha Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, ha Rabbanan. We'll say two different opinions. So the Gemara says, Tanya idach another brayso, marbitzin sadalav and erev shviyas kadesh yetzi yirakas b'shviyas. You're permitted to go ahead and sprinkle a grain field on erev shviyas in order that things grow there, right? In order that the vegetables will easily come out on shviyas. So we'll say what this is talking about over here is you're permitted to go ahead and water a field in year number 6 in order that year 6 produce will easily emerge from the soil on year 7. Furthermore, you can go ahead and sprinkle the field on the Shemitah year in order that the produce easily emerges on year number 8. So I want to point out, this is incredibly important, which is that halacha lemaisa, remember, during a Shemitah year, and this is very lemaisa now, during a Shemitah year, it's not the pshat that everything that grows from the earth is going to have Shemitah sanctity. Remember, if you have year 6 produce that is emerging on year number 7, that produce is not governed by Shemitah strictures, right? That produce ultimately is called year 6 produce, and again, so therefore what the Gemara is saying over here is, on year number 6, you can do certain things to the field which will allow you to extract year number 6 produce more easily on year number 7. So too on year number 7, the Shemitah year, you're allowed to do things which may facilitate the growth of year 8 produce. Beautiful. That's the end of the sugya. Mishnah. Sadanas ha'ishos azach bara mistea ilan mistea lavan kidarko. The Moed b'shitz. What's an interesting case here? You could trap an ishus. We're going to see what an ishus is. It's some type of animal. You're allowed to trap an ishus and mice. From the Sedea Ilan, what I say? So Sedea Ilan, remember again, means like an orchard. An orchard, literally a sada in which trees grow. So you could trap these animals, which undermine the growth. In a sada Ilan, and Sadeh halavan is a grain field or a wheat field, and you could trap these animals in a normal fashion, both on Chalamayid as well as during Shemitah. Good. Vechram the Chum say, Mistea Ilan Kidako, you could trap the animals in a normal way in a Sedea Ilan, in an orchard. However, Mistea Lavan Shlo Kidako, but in a grain field, in a wheat field, you could only trap them in an abnormal fashion. So I'll say, so Bepashtos, what the Chacham say is like this, that apparently these animals do much more damage in a Sedea Ilan than they do in a Sedea Lavan. They do much more damage in an orchard than in a grain field. Therefore, again, in the orchard, you could trap them in the normal fashion, but in the grain field, you have to go ahead and employ a shinui. If you have a fence that's become breached, you could seal the breach on Chalamayid, and during the Shemitah year, you could even go ahead and build a wall in a normal fashion. Again, we'll define exactly what all of these particular cases are. Well, Rashi actually says over here, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, but say if you have a wall that became partially breached, on Chalamayid, you can go ahead and repair the breach. Again, we'll discuss how, we'll discuss what. On Shemitah, Rashi says over here, Mitchila, you could even build a brand new wall. The chiddush of that we're going to see is on Shemitah, your produce, your field is hefker, and therefore it has, part of it being hefker is it has to be accessible to all. So you might have thought that the building of a wall would be usher because it looks like you're safeguarding your produce for your own personal use. Kamash B'lo, no, you're permitted to build the wall. Again, we'll discuss the parameters of that building. Says the Gemara, my ishus. Both say, what's an ishus? What's an ishus? Right? Remember, here's what we know from the Mishnah. The ishus is a type of animal that does apparently extensive damage, both in an orchard as well as in a grain field. So what exactly is an ishus? Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Beria she'ein la inayim. It is an animal that does not have eyes. Does not have eyes. But say it's interesting, if you look up, right, remember I got a little blast from the past over here, right? If you look up in the Jastro dictionary, right, it will say before the days of Art Scroll, right, the Jastro was, that was the go-to for anything and everything regarding the Gemara. So it's often interesting because what he does also by many of these words is he gives you etymology. He translates ishus as a mole. So again, now, I don't know, I Googled it, a mole has eyes, I don't know, but again, I guess because a mole generally operates in the darkness, maybe the Gemara says that it's like it doesn't have eyes. Okay, anyway, that's how he translates it, a mole. So the Gemara says, "Beria she'ein la inayim." Amar Rabbi Bar Yishmael, Avi Tobias, Rabbi Yimar Bar Shalmi, Maikra. So we'll say, what's the idea? What's the pasuk? In other words, meaning, what's the pasuk that highlights that this ishus is like a blind animal? So it says the Gemara quotes over here the pasuk from Tehillim, Kimo Shablul Temes Yaloch. We'll say Shablul is a snail, just like the snail. Tamos Yaloch disintegrates as it goes. Rashi points out that if the snail comes out of its shell, so it slowly disintegrates. So nefel eshes bal chazu shemesh. The eshes will also die, will fall down as soon as it sees the sun. So David HaMelech in Tehillim highlights his idea that the eshes is this animal that operates in the darkness, and if it comes out of the darkness, it is overwhelmed by the sun. Good. Supposed to listen to this. So the Bracha says as follows. The Bracha says that you're permitted to go ahead and trap the ishus, called the mole, as well as the mice, mistea lavan, from a grain field, or mistea ilan, from an orchard, kidarko, in the normal fashion. So you could trap them in the normal fashion. Umachrivin chore nemalin. You could also destroy ant holes. So when a person has an ant hole in their field, and a person is concerned that the ants are undermining the quality or eroding the crop. Halacha l'maisa, you could destroy the ant holes on Chalamayra or on Shemitah. Rabbi Silber says, how do you destroy an ant hole? It's very interesting. Maybe afar mechor zeh v'nosen l'so chor zeh ve'in chokin zeh zeh. We'll say, how do you destroy an ant hole? So it's very interesting. So you might think the way you destroy an ant hole is just stomp on it. So in fact, apparently that does not work. Instead, how do you do it? You go ahead and you take dirt. You take dirt from another area. Take dirt, maybe afar mechor zeh. Take dirt from another hole. Pour it into this first hole. And the ants literally means they choke each other. Now if you look at Rashi says over ultimately, again, because the ants apparently they get used to their soil, and when they sense new soil, they panic. And ultimately, whatever it means, they trample each other, they choke, they suffocate, whatever it might be. But I'll tell you, it's just such a powerful use. So, let's finish. So the Gemara says, now this only works assuming what? Only if you take dirt from two sides of the river. In other words, that an ant is familiar with the immediately surrounding dirt. So if you take dirt from the other side of the river, and assuming there's no bridge across the two sides of the river, there's no board across the two sides of the river, there's no rope across the two sides of the river. Ad kaman, how far apart do they have to be? There's machlokes Rashi tells us exactly how to read this line. In other words, ad kama, how much distance does there have to be? Rashi says even with the bridge, Tosa says without the bridge. Okay, ad kama, ad parsa. So we'll say the idea being that in order for this strategy to work, it has to be dirt with which the ants, your ants, are totally unfamiliar with. But if the new dirt is in close proximity to the old dirt, then the strategy doesn't work. I will say, listen to the incredible Musar Haskell. How do you go ahead and kill ants? How do you kill ants? Introduce soil, introduce dirt, introduce a reality with which they are unfamiliar with. See what I'm saying? The fundamental difference between the ant and the human being is that the ant has the inability to adapt. You see, the ant knows it's dirt. It knows it's dirt. And that's all it knows. Introduce any other dirt, and by definition, the ant will simply cease to exist. You see, I will say, the godless of a human being and the greatest koach that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given to each of us is the ability to adapt, is the ability to pivot. You see, all of us also get used to our own soil. I get used to my own circumstances, I get used to my own realities, and then what happens when life throws me a curveball? What happens when new dirt is introduced? So I will say, very often we panic, very often we get overwhelmed. Chonkin zu et zu. We feel like we've reached the end of the line, there's no way for me to go on. And then what happens? I take a deep breath and I say, you know what? I got this. I can handle this. The way you kill ants is just simply introduce a new reality, because they have no ability to pivot, no ability to adapt. But the weakness of the ant is the very strength of the Jew. Give me new dirt, give me new circumstances, give me new realities. Will I panic? Absolutely. But as soon as I stop panicking and calm myself down, I will realize that I have the koach to pivot, I have the koach to adapt. Such an incredible Musar Haskell. So we'll say the Gemara goes weiter. Top of Zayin Amud Aleph. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mistia Ilan Kedarko, Mistia Lavan Shalo Kedarko. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says you can go ahead, Rabbi Yehuda says that you can go ahead and trap the moles and the mice from a grain field in a normal fashion, and from an orchard in a normal fashion, and from a grain field with a shinui. Shelo kedarko means with a shinui, an abnormal fashion. So obviously Rabbi Yehuda's saying is like this, that the moles and the mice pose a much greater danger, or much greater loss to the orchard than they do the grain field. So in the orchard, you could trap them on chalamayid even in the normal fashion, but in the grain field, you should go ahead and employ a shinui. Says the Gemara Tarabanan, Kates kedarko. By the way, it's good to know, how do you trap moles and mice? This is really more geared towards moles in a normal fashion. It's very interesting. Chofer guma, you dig a hole, v'tole ba mitsuda, and you hang a trap inside of the hole. Apparently, the way to catch a mole is you have to create a subterranean trap. So you figure out, right, the derech of the mole. You figure out, right, the path the mole is taking, and you put a subterranean trap. That's how you go ahead and you catch it. So the Gemara says, or what's shelo kedarko? What's an abnormal way to go ahead and catch a mole? So noitz shipud umake bekarnos. What's very interesting? You take essentially a shipud, like a shipud literally means a spit. You take a spit and a hammer and you hammer it. Otherwise, what you do is you cause a collapse. You see, remember again, moles create subterranean tunnels. So it's kind of like what the IDF does with Hamas, right? You got to trap the moles, right? The idea is you just blow. In other words, you go ahead and you cause the tunnels to collapse. And if you cause the tunnels to collapse, ultimately again you kill the moles inside. So the Gemara says, Umaka b'kornus, umirag deha adama tachtel, and again, you just cause the earth to collapse underneath the mole. So says the Gemara, Tanya, Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, Kisha Amro mistei lavan shelo kedarko. When we said before, so remember, in Rabbi Yehuda's Shita, he holds that halacha l'maisa, in an orchard you could trap the moles in the mice in a normal fashion, and in a grain field, shelo kedarko. So it comes along the Gemara, when we said that in the grain field you could trap shelo kedarko, lo amra ella b'stei lavan hasmucha le'ir. That's talking about a grain field that is close to the city. Aval b'stei lavan hasmucha l'sadeh ha'ilon. But I will say, what happens if you have a grain field that is next to an orchard? Then in that case, I will say, remember again, we've already established that moles and mice pose a much greater loss to orchards. So therefore, if you have a grain field that's next to an orchard, afilu kidarko, you could even trap the moles and the mice in what? In a normal fashion, right? And again, because the logic is if you don't get them in the grain field, and the grain field is right next to the orchard, what's going to happen? They're going to make their way into the orchard. So the Gemara says, Shema yetzu, misteh halavan, v'yachribu asailanos, because maybe ultimately, again, they'll go ahead and they'll leave the grain field and destroy the orchard. Good. So we'll say, it's good. So, good, fine. So the Gemara says as follows: Umakrunes apirtza b'moed. Suppose it's the next case. So now what we've established is you're permitted to go ahead and trap animals that are going to cause. Suppose it's all the same halacha, which is the activities that you're allowed to do on Chol HaMoed in order to go ahead and stave off a hefsid meruba. So up until now, what we've been focusing on is watering. That's what we've been focusing on. Now the Gemara is talking about staving off a different kind of loss, which is rodents or animals that are going to destroy your field. Salach l'mais, what essentially comes out is if it's a significant loss, ultimately you could trap in a normal fashion. If it's not as significant loss, you have to use a shinui, with one exception. If it's going to cause an insignificant loss now, but the insignificant loss has the potential to cause a significant loss in the adjacent field, then you could trap in the normal fashion. Beautiful. So the next part of the Mishnah, Makrinas apirtza b'moed, we'll say if you have a fence that's been breached, right? A fence that's been breached, so you can go ahead and repair the breach on Chol HaMoed. So it says in our Kates and Makrin, just by the way, how do you repair a breach? Rav Yosef Amar Behutza v'dafna. You could essentially go ahead and repair it with branches. So when the Gemara says, when the Mishnah says that you could repair a breach on Chol HaMoed, Rav Yosef essentially explains that halacha l'maisa chutza v'dafna, which literally means again branches, right? Palm branches. So the idea over here is that you could take branches and essentially make a temporary temporary repair, right? So you can't start with stones and plaster and things like that, but you could put up branches to repair the breach. B'masni satana, so the Mishnah we learned as well, sar tzuror ve'enotach betit, or you could pile stones. You can pile stones, but you can't cement the stones in place. In other words, on Chol HaMoed, what I could do is, I could essentially repair the breach in a temporary fashion. So you could use branches, or you could use unplastered stones. When we speak about putting back a temporary repair, that's only with the wall that leads to your garden. Aval kosel hachotzer, but if we're talking about the wall which leads into your courtyard, then what? Bone kidarko. You're permitted to go ahead, if there's a breach, you're permitted to rebuild it in the normal fashion. Why the distinction? Look at Rashi. So Rashi is Bekosel Gina. Deleka Psedi Yisiri Eli Be'inshi. So will say, people come into my garden, I'm not really going to suffer a loss. Aval Bekosel Chatzer Rashi is Bonekidarko Diika Psedi Yisera. Eli Ba Ganvi Veganvi Mamone. So will say, the wall to my Chatzer is the wall to what? Is the wall to what? The wall to my home. That's my domicile. So the Gemara says, when we speak about the idea, when the Mishnah says that if the wall was breached, you could go ahead and fix it, but it's got to be a temporary fix. That's the wall to your garden. That's the wall to your garden. Because ultimately, we're not so concerned about a loss over there. But Allah Chalamayis, if the wall to your chutzner, the wall to your domicile, right, not directly into your home, but this is the courtyard that is right by your home, that represents a security risk. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if that's breached on chalamayid, you're permitted to repair it normally on chalamayid, which means stones, cement, bricks, whatever it is that you're normally repairing it with. Levi Masayah, I suppose you have a brisa that supports this. Kosel, listen to this interesting case. Kosel ha-gochel l'rishos harabim. Both say, if you have a wall that is kind of bent, gocha means, Rashi says over here, shocha v'natoi. It's leaning. You have a leaning wall, and the wall is leaning into the public domain. What's the halacha? Soser ubone kidarko mipnei hasakana. You can go ahead about saying what? You can go ahead and, first of all, demolish it, right? You could demolish it, and you could rebuild it. Now, both say, this is a more obvious case. Why are you permitted to do this? Why? Because this poses a danger. So what do you see here, Rabbi Say? That anytime you have a danger, anytime there's a potential danger, that gives you the license to go ahead and rebuild the wall. So the Gemara is quoting this. The Gemara is quoting this ultimately as a statement, as a support to Rav Chisda. Because Rav Chisda said, when do we say that you could only go ahead and make a temporary fix? That's with the wall to your gina, to your garden. But the wall to your chutzner, you can make even a permanent, normal fix because that represents a security issue. The Gemara then goes ahead and quotes this Mishnah, that says that if you have a wall leaning into the Rosh Hashanah, you could demolish the wall and you could rebuild it because it poses a risk. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not a fair example. Hasam kidiktani taima me'asakana. We'll say it may not be a good comparison. In other words, when you're dealing with a wall, first of all, that's actively leaning. So you say a wall that's actively leaning represents a clear and present danger, right? That the idea is that's a collapse danger that poses a public safety issue. The case of Rav Chisda says where the wall of my chutzner was breached, it's a potential issue. Maybe it'll be an issue, maybe it won't be an issue. To which the Gemara says, the Ikeda Amir, an alternate version of this, Tashma. If you have a wall that is leaning into the public domain, you're permitted to demolish the wall and rebuild the wall. Why? Because it poses a danger. Now the reason you're permitted to go ahead and what? And demolish it and rebuild it is because it poses a sakana, right? If there was no sakana, if you just had a leaning wall that was leaning into the middle of nowhere, or for that matter, again, it sounds like even a breached wall which doesn't pose a sakana, perhaps you should be able to repair it. Leima tehevei tiyufta de Rav Chisda. This would seem to refute the position of Rav Chisda. Because remember, let's go back for a second. Rav Chisda said that you're permitted to repair a wall even when there's the potential of what? Of loss. Right, of loss. Rashi says over here, remember again, Rav Chisda said, Pseida Yisera. Rav Chisda wanted to make let's go back for just one moment. Rav Chisda's position is that if the wall of my gina, the wall of my garden, or the wall of my field is breached, what am I permitted to do on Chalamayid? What can I do? What can I do? Temporary fix, right? Branches. What happens if the wall of my chutzner is breached according to Rav Chisda? Regular fix. To which the Gemara says, interestingly enough, this case seems to contradict Rav Chisda, because in this case, when are you permitted to fix a wall? When you have a wall that poses a sakana. Rav Chisda said you could go ahead and fix a wall in your chutzner even when it poses the potential of loss. Both say loss and sakana are two different things. So maybe only time you're permitted to fix a wall is where there's the potential of sakana. But if there's just the potential of loss, you can't fix it. Maybe you could do your temporary fix, right? Your branches, but you certainly can't do a regular fix. This would seem to undermine Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, no, it doesn't at all undermine me. I'll tell you why. Hasam soser ubone. Say in the Brisa's case of the wall leaning into the Shtarabim, there's two things you're allowed to do when there's sakana. What are the two things? Number one, demolish. Number 2, rebuild. In sakana, you could demolish and rebuild. Hacha, in my case, where there's no sakana, there's just the potential of loss. Bona velo soser. I agree. You wouldn't be able to demolish a wall for that. And as well say, imagine the following situation. Let's say I have a breach in the wall to my chatzar. The contractor comes out and he says to me, you know what? As contractors often say, it's easier just to rebuild the whole thing. Right? Just take the whole thing down. Let's take the whole thing down, let's just rebuild the whole thing. So I'll say, imagine the contractor said that to me. Rav Chisda would say, I would agree, you can't do that. You can't do that. In other words, the only thing you can do on Chalamayid is just to go ahead and rebuild the breach. And if it's in your chutz, you can rebuild it in the normal way. The only time you're permitted to totally demolish something and rebuild it would be when? In a situation of sakana. To which the Gemara says, Hasam nami listar velo livni. Im came, so we'll say, I'm sorry, Hasam nami listar velo livni. If that's the case, I will say, so why don't we say that in this situation, why not say in the situation where halacha lamaisa, the wall is leaning into the sarabim, what should we do? Demolish it and don't rebuild it. To which the Gemara says, Im kain mimna velo soser. So I will say, just to understand, the case that we're talking about over here is, whose wall is this? Whose wall? Right? Who is the owner of the leaning wall? It's some guy, right? It's an individual. It's Ruvain, right? Ruvain owns the wall. So Rav Chisda says like this: if we just tell Ruvain that he has to demolish it, but we don't let him rebuild it, then what's going to happen? He's not going to demolish it. Because at the end of the day, this wall probably serves some purpose, otherwise he wouldn't have it. So I will say human nature is, and there's also such an incredible yisod. If you make doing the right thing easy, most people will do it. If you make doing the right thing too difficult, most people will not do it. Even good people will not do it. That's just human nature. Sa'ai Ruvain, your wall is leaning into Rosh Sarabim, and there is a danger of collapse, and it can chas v'shalom pose a danger to the rabbim. So if you tell Ruvain, take down your wall, but you can't rebuild it, so now maybe some part of his property is exposed, he's probably not going to do it. But if you tell him, listen, take it down, and we also give you the license to rebuild it, then Einachinami, under those circumstances, he will do the right thing. But we'll say, brother, you see this motif many times in halacha, most notably the concept of Gzeras Hashavin, which I will say is the Gzera that says that when a person steals something, we don't make them return the item that they've stolen, right? If it's too inconvenient, we let them go ahead and what? We let them go ahead and return the value without returning the item. I also remember the paradigmatic example of this was, right? Reuven stole a beam from Shimon, went ahead and built the beam into his house. And he has, right, the style of architecture, what do they call it? Exposed beams? Is that the name of the style, right? So you see the beam right there. It's sitting right there. It even has Reuven's initials carved into it when Reuven owned it, right? So you say, Shimon, listen, you want to be about Tshuva? You got to take the beam back and give it back to Reuven. But let's say if that's what it takes for Shimon to be a Baal Tshuva, then what? Shimon's never going to become Baal Tshuva. So Chazal say it's in society's best interest for people to do the right thing. So let's make it easy. Same thing over here. Ideally, I will say what should happen over here is if Reuven has a leaning wall, we should tell him take it down, right? Take it down and rebuild it when after Chalamayid. Right, later on, you don't need to rebuild it now. Right, rebuild it, but again, Reuven's not going to take it down. So therefore, Rav Chisda says, Halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah's case is a case of allowing you to demolish and then rebuild. I'm only talking about a case of just rebuilding, right? Where I have a wall of my chutzner, part of the wall fell down. So Rav Chisda says like this: if it's the wall to my garden, you just could use a temporary fix. But if it's the wall to my chutzner where there's a real potential for real loss, then in that case, I'm permitted to go ahead and make a permanent fix, even on Chalamayid. Amar Bashi, Masnisi Namideka, Diktani, Ubeshvias Bone Kedarko. During Shemitah, you're allowed to go ahead and rebuild the wall in the normal fashion. So the Gemara says, Dehecha, what case are we talking about? Ilema de Chatzer, if you're talking about the wall of the Chatzer, Tzricha Lememar, both say, why would the Mishnah need to tell me, why would the Brisa need to tell me that Halacha Lamaisa, why would the Mishnah need to tell me that Halacha Lamaisa, I can rebuild the wall to my chutzner during Shemitah? Of course I can rebuild the wall to my chutzner. So also, what does my chutzner have to do with Shemitah? Ela lav digina. Rather, what it must mean is, during Shemitah, if the wall to my garden collapses, I could rebuild that wall. The afa gav demechze kiman da'avin tirusileperi. And even though I both say, what's the problem? When you erect a wall around a field during Shemitah, I both say, what does that look like? What does it look like? It looks like you're going ahead and guarding the fruit and preventing other people from coming in. Even though, again, now that's not my intention. My intention is, I just want to rebuild my wall. Shema mina, therefore learn out from me that it's permitted. So Rabbi say, what comes out from this sugi is as follows. Halacha l'maisa, supposed to we essentially have three different halachas. During Shemitah, I could rebuild the wall of my chutzner, no problem. Right? That goes without saying because the wall of my chutzner has nothing to do with Shemitah. What's the novelty in Shemitah? The novelty in Shemitah is that when the wall around my field crumbles, right, or gets breached, I could repair the breach. What's the chiddush in that? You might have thought you can't repair the breach in the wall around your field. Why? Because it looks like you're keeping people out, and that's the antithesis of Shemitah. Kamash b'ala, no, I'm not keeping people out. I'm providing some level of safety and security for my field, and that's permitted. That's Shemitah. What about Chalamayid? So I'll say Chalamayid, if your wall breaches, what can you do on Chalamayid? And the answer is, we pass like Rav Chisda, and it depends. What does it depend on? Which wall we're talking about. If it's the wall of my gina, if it's the wall of my field, then what am I permitted to do on Chalamayid? Temporary fix, right? Branches. Just plug it up. After Chalamayid, you'll fix it in normal fashion. But if it is the wall of my chutzner, we paskin like Rav Chisda, and a breach in the wall of my chutzner represents a real potential loss. This is the breach in the wall to my domicile. So halacha l'maisa, you're permitted to repair that in a normal fashion, even on Chalamayid. Both say that is how the Rabban paskins. Incredible. Says the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir Omer, both say very interesting sugya. Rabbi Meir Omer, ro'anes hanagolim b'tchil lahakyav alo lahachmir. Shabbos, now we come to the interesting case over here. Now, tzaras. So remember again, in order to go ahead and become a mitzora, you must go to the Kohen, and the Kohen must pronounce you a mitzora. Right? So that's the way it works. In other words, even if you're well versed in halachos of tzaras, and you see a discoloration on your flesh, it doesn't work. You can't declare yourself as right. There's no home tests for tzaras, right? Rather, you have to go ahead and you have to go to the Kohen. The Kohen has to look at you, and the Kohen has to paskin. So now, we're getting to the interesting discussion about does the Kohen paskin on tzaras on Chalamayid or not? So Rabbi Meir says, "Ro es hanagoim lahakel aval lo lahachmir." So we'll say this is fascinating. So Rabbi Meir says you can go to the Kohen on Chalamayid, but he only will paskin leniently and not stringently. Now what does this mean? Look at Rashi. Roa nesanagam lahakel kilomar roa hakoin nega saras b'moed litaher. So the Kohen will go ahead and look at saras to declare it tahar about lo lahachmir. Rashi says shimroa kohen shu tamei eno omer klum shemitamo nimtza mitzara b'moed v'rachmana omar v'samachta b'chagecha. So this is so beautiful. So the Rabbi Meir says like this. So if you go to the Kohen and the Kohen sees that it's tar, he could tell you tar. But if he sees that it's tamei, he doesn't say anything. Why can't he say anything? Because also if the Kohen declares it tamei, that is going to shter, that is going to undermine your enjoyment of the Yom Tov, and there is a biblical obligation of v'samachta b'chagecha. So what does the Kohen say if he sees that you're tamei? What does he say? Nothing. Rabbi said, you'll say to yourself, but come on, I don't understand. If it's tar, he would say tar. If he says nothing, isn't that by definition what? A de facto declaration of tumah, to which you see, no, there's something fascinating. That halacha l'maisa, you're actually not tamei until when? Until the Kohen makes the active declaration of tumah. So in other words, say, the absence of a tahar declaration does not automatically make you tahar. We'll say it's an incredible yisod. That according to Rabbi Meir, the way tzaras works is there must be an active amira. Without an active declaration, you have an undefined status. So you can actively declare you tahar or actively declare you tamei. Say if you show up on Chalamayid, if he actively declares you tar, you're tar. But if he sees that you're tamei, he'll simply say nothing. And the absence of an active declaration, by definition, allows the person to remain. Now again, they're in a limbo status, right? Right now again, I'm nothing. So I'm the same as I was before I came to the Kohen, which is there's something going on with me. I'm just not sure. Well, so I'll just point out something amazing. What an incredible Musar Haskell, by the way, that sometimes in life, saying nothing doesn't automatically create a reality. We've spoken on this many times, especially in the realm of relationships. So sometimes we think that people know how we feel about them without expressing it. Right? I don't have to tell my wife I love her. She knows that I love her. That's obvious, right? And it's even clear from my behaviors. You see what I say from Rabbi Meir, that realities are only created when you say things. Right? When you just simply allow people, when you assume that people understand how you feel about them without ever communicating it, you have not created a reality. Realities are only created when you say tameh, when you say tar. Only if you say it is the reality created. Because that's Rabbi Meir. So the Chachamim say, Omrim lo lahakev lo lahachmir. Now both say, the Chachamim say, now we'll have to see in the Gemara exactly what the Chachamim are saying, but they say, no, essentially, don't show up to the Kohen at all. Lo lahakel for lo lahachmir. The Kohen doesn't paskin ansaras at all over the course of Yom Tov. So I will say, it's a fundamental machlokes. So again, I will say, and this is very shayef, this is a very lemaisa case. Person has some type of discoloration. He's not sure exactly what it is. According to Rabbi Meir, go to the Kohen. Go to the Kohen. Kohen's either going to tell you one thing. He's either going to tell you what? Either tahar or nothing. Chachamim say no, don't go to the Kohen, go after Yom Tov. Go after Yom Tov. Says the Gemara. Both say also, by the way, it's so profound. You know what else the Chachamim are teaching us? Sounds like the Chachamim are teaching us. Is we're saying, just hear this out till the end. Sometimes it's okay not to deal with your problems. In other words, we'll say, what do I mean by that? Is that sometimes a person has a particular issue, and I know I have to deal with it, but I can't deal with it now. That's very different than ignoring your problems, right? Ignoring my problems means, I know I have a problem, but then no, I'm going to forget about it and I'll pretend like it doesn't exist. That's wrong. But sometimes acknowledging that there is a challenge in life, but I can't deal with it right now, right? The issue is there, but now is not the right time to handle it. Sometimes that's an okay strategy. Sometimes it's the wrong strategy, but sometimes saying, I know it's here, but I can't deal with it now, is an okay approach. Incredible. So it says the Gemara, Tanya, Rabbi Meir, Omer, Roanis, Hanigoyim, Lahakev, Alo, Lahachmir. So say Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah said that what? You could look at Nigoyim, and you have an option, right? What's your option? Go to the Kohen. The Kohen could tell you Tar, but he's not going to tell you Tameh. Right? So we'll say, in other words, just so you understand how this plays out. So I show up to the Kohen, right? The Kohen looks at it, and what does the Kohen say? If he sees the problem, what does he say? Yeah, I'll see you later. Let's grab a cup of coffee after Yom Tov together, right? Let's connect then, right? And that's all. Now, of course, we'll say, now, by the way, what I just want to point out was, just so you should know, is that when I leave the Kohen, right? Does that automatically mean that I'm Tameh? Now remember again, I'm not coming back to him after Yom Tov, which means a whole bunch of stuff could occur with this particular lesion, right? So it really doesn't mean anything at that point in time, except the Kohen's telling me, I'm not going to share your Simchas Yom Tov, so come back later on. So that's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi says, Lo lahakev lo lahachmir. Rabbi Yossi says, no. Don't show up to the Kohen at all. Why? Shim'ata niskak lo lahakel, niskak lo af lachmer. So both say, this is incredible. There's a fundamental machlokes. See, Rabbi Meir is saying that a Kohen has the license to say tahar, but not to say tameh. Rabbi Yossi says, no. Once someone shows up in front of you, then what? You got to decide. There's no such thing as saying, either you're tar or come back and see me after Yom Tov. There needs to be a ruling. Now, we'll say, sometimes, I want to be clear, we're going to discuss this. Sometimes the ruling is the Kohen is not sure about the nega. That's fine. But if there is a definitive or decisive ruling, that has to be delivered. Say Rabbi Yossi says the Kohen doesn't have the license to say come back later, right? If he knows that it's a tamei nega. Shemata niskak lo lahakel, niskak lo af lachmer. Because if you force him to rule lakula, he's also forced to go ahead and rule the chumrah. Rashi says over kilomar me'acha shera'eh kohen omer beinu tamei beinu tar. So we'll say, so this is a fundamental machlokes. fundamental machlokes. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rebbe says, this is very interesting, Nirin Divrei Rabbi Meir b'muskar, the Divrei Rabbi Yossi b'muchlat. So we'll say, so just to define our terms here for just a moment. There's what's called the Mitzorah Muskar, Mitzorah Muchlat. Mitzorah Muskar is a person who shows up to the Kohen, and the Kohen is not sure about his nega. So we'll say, just to give you just a simple case in this. The paradigmatic case of tzaras is where I have a discoloration on my skin, and the hairs inside of the skin also turns white. Everything turns white. What if you have the following situation? There's a blemish that's white, but the hairs inside of the blemish have not turned white. So we'll say in a situation like that, what we do is we quarantine the person. Quarantine him. That's called a Mitzorah Muskar, a quarantined Mitzorah. What's the status of a quarantined Mitzorah? Nothing yet. He's quarantined. We're not sure. We're not sure what his status is. We're just not sure what his status is. That's called Mitzorah Muskar. He's quarantined. Versus a Mitzorah Muchlat is a definitive Mitzorah. Someone who is absolutely a Mitzorah. So Rabbi says like this, I see the position of Rabbi Meir in the case of a Mitzorah Muskar, and Rabbi Yossi in the case of a Mitzorah Muchlat. Why? Rabbi say, let's play this out. So Rabbi is going to say, listen, if a Mitzorah Muskar, quarantine Mitzorah, comes to the Kohen, so one of two things happens, right? Either number one, the Kohen says you're tar. If he says you're tar, great. What happens? What happens if you're tar? You had a quarantine. What happens if he says simulator? We'll say, what happens then? You just go back to quarantine. In other words, you're back in the same state. You're no worse off. You're no worse off for coming to see the Kohen. Versus in the case of a Mitzorah Muchlat, ultimately, again, Rebbe says, I think in that case, ultimately we should paskin like Rabbi Yossi, because Rebbe say essentially in that case, once the guy's already a Mitzorah Muchlat, there's only one way, which is up, right? He's already a confirmed Mitzorah, so there's only one way forward. Amar Rava, so we'll say Rava defines a little bit more. Betar kuli amalo pligi de lo chazule. So we'll say, listen to this. There are essentially three cases. Case number one is a guy who's tahar, which Rava say means what? Ruvain was fine, minding his own business. He suddenly discovers he's got a discoloration on his arm, right? See, now he wants to come to the Kohen. So Rava says, everyone agrees that if you're tar, and now you suddenly have this discoloration for the first time, don't come on Yom Tiv. Come after Yom Tiv. Right? The halacha tells you, don't deal with your problem now, deal with it after Yom Tov. Kuli amalo pligi de lo chazule. Behesker Rishon, Rabbi say, if you're talking about a guy who was quarantined the first time, because remember Rabbi say, there are up to 2 quarantines per individual, right? In other words, that halacha l'maisa, if you present with the symptoms, and we're not sure exactly what you are, we'll quarantine you a first time. If the nega doesn't change at all, we'll quarantine you a second time. If after the second quarantine, the nega does not change, you're tar. We leave you alone. Let's say, see, isn't that incredible? Even Chazal understood. You can't be quarantined more than 2 times, right? More than 2 times is ridiculous, right? So there's a cap. There's a cap as how long you could go on like this. So the Gemara says as follows. So now listen to this. Behesker Rishon, if you're quarantined the first time, everyone will agree that the Kohen will examine you on Chalamayid. So look at Rashi, Behesker Rishon, Shemitarele Misamechle, because let's figure this out. If you're in your first quarantine, if the Kohen goes ahead and is mitare you, that adds to your Simchas Yom Tov. Lo mitarele, if he doesn't declare you tamei, lo mitamele yosim indikar. You're no worse off than you were in the beginning. In other words, your quarantine continues. So therefore, I'll say, keep ligi. Where does the machlokes come up? Amud Beis. Behez Gersheni. We'll say the machlokes comes up with a person that was quarantined the second time. So we'll say, so just to illustrate where this case comes up, right? Reuven has a discoloration on his arm. It's a simple case. The discoloration is white, the hairs are not. He comes to the Kohen. What happens to a person like this? Quarantine. Because what are we looking for? We're looking to see if the hairs turn white. If the hairs turn white, this guy is a Mitzorah. End of quarantine number 1, hairs still haven't turned white. What do? We quarantine him a second time. So one of 2 things happen by the end of quarantine number 2. If the hairs turn white, now he's a Mitzorah, right? If the hairs don't turn white, we attribute this discoloration to something other than saras, and he is free to go about his life. So therefore, Rabbi say, the Gemara says like this. If he's tahar, meaning he just developed the symptoms, right? So everyone agrees, don't come to the Kohen and Chalamayid. We know you have a problem. Sometimes it's okay not to deal with the problem right now. Come back after Yom Tiv. If he's in the midst of the first quarantine, everyone agrees, go to the Kohen. Why? Because there's only an upside, right? If the Kohen declares you tar, you're out, right? That intensifies your Simchas Yom Tiv. And if he says you're still in quarantine, you're no worse off than you were before. Where does the machlokes come up? With a guy who's in his second quarantine. Watch this. Mar savar b'kohen talya milsa itar amar leitar v'tamei shasik. So one opinion says, go to the coin. Go to the coin. Because what's going to happen on both sides? Everything depends on the coin anyway. So if the coin sees you're in your second quarantine, if the coin sees that you're tar, he'll tell you you're tar, and incredible. And if he sees you're not tar, then what? He's not going to say anything. He's not going to say anything. He'll just come back after Yom Tov, and that's it. Umar savar l'tahara u'letam oksiv. So I will say this goes back to the original machlokes we said before in the Gemara between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir, which is, does a kohen have a right not to paskin tameh? So the first opinion will say yes. The kohen has a right to tell you tahar, and then he has a right to say, if you're tameh, you know what, come back later on, or not to say anything. The second opinion says, no, the kohen has no such license. The kohen is obligated to paskin. And because he's obligated to paskin, halacha l'maisa, he could turn a mitzora muskar, a quarantined mitzora, into a mitzora muchlat, into a definitive mitzora. And therefore, perhaps we're better off not seeing that mitzora over chalamayid at all. Shabbos say, fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi about whether or not a kohen has the right to withhold a tamei declaration, which is really quite fascinating. Amar Mar, Amar Rabbi, Nir and Div Rabbi Yossi b'muchlat, Div Rabbi Meir b'muskar. Shabbos say, so remember again, so Rabbi said before, I think I agree to the position of Rabbi Yossi by a mitzora muchlat, a definitive mitzora, and the words of Rabbi Meir by a mitzora muskar. But we said just the opposite before. Tanaihi, it's really a machlokes tanoim. Aliba de Rabbi, according to Rabbi, Shabbos said this is fascinating. Tanei aliba de Rabbi, Mar savart savsad de alma adifle, umar savart savsad de ishto adifale. Shabbos say, this is absolutely fascinating. See, Shabbos say, listen to what happens over here. You see, the fundamental machlokes Shabbos say is, do we want a guy turning from a muskar to a muchlat on chalamayid? Right, so you hear this? A mitzora muskar is a quarantine mitzora. Mitzora muchlat is a definitive mitzora. See, herein lies the machlokes. On chalamayid, are we okay with the guy transitioning from a mitzora muskar to a mitzora muchlat? And I will say, what does it depend on? Listen to how fascinating this is. What is your thing, mitzora muskar and mitzora muchlat? So I will say, mitzora muskar, you're quarantined, but you're not exiled from the three camps of Klal Yisrael. But you're not allowed to live with your wife, right? Versus a mitzora muchlat, you are exiled from outside of the three camps, but you're permitted to be with your wife, right? So we'll say, see here the distinction over here? So again, when you're a muskar, you're besocha machana, right? You're living with Klal Yisrael, but you're separated from your wife. When you're mitzora muchlat, you're exiled from the camp, but your wife could come with you. Your wife could come with you. Shabbos says, what's the machlokes? Get ready for this. The Gemara says, what's the machlokes? Mar savar tzavsa de ishto adifale. Sorry. Mar savar tzavsa de alma adifle, or Mar savar tzavsa de ishto adifale. But you know what the machlokes is? Who would people rather be with? Who would a person rather be with? Right? Would he rather be with other people, or would he rather be with his wife? Now, both say, don't chime in on this. I would urge you strongly, right? Right? Don't proffer an opinion to your friend. But both say, but it is a fundamental machlokes as to what creates greater simcha for a person. Being away from Klal Yisrael, but being with one's wife, because that's when you're a Masorah Muskar, you're outside of the three camps, but your wife could be with you. Or is it right? So as long as the person has his wife, he's good, he has Simchas Yom Tiv. Or no, being outside of the three camps, even if my wife is with me, that takes away from my Simchas Yom Tiv, because a person would prefer to be in the camp, even if he can't be with his wife. So I will say, take a look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says over here, Mar sarat savsa de ishto adifale. So it's actually, you know what, let's just go a little bit weiter first. Lememra, the muchlat mutter b'tashmin shamita. So the way you're setting this up is that halacha l'maisa, when a person is a mitzora muchlat, which means a bona fide mitzora, he's permitted to live with his wife, right? Relations are permitted. Is that true? And it is true. Vatanya, we learned v'yashav michutz li ohalo shivas yamim. We learned, and this is in the purification process. In the purification process, he has to sit outside of his tent for 7 days. So what does that teach me? So ultimately, during the 7 days of his purification, remember again, there's a whole bunch of different things. When a person is a mitzora muchlat, a confirmed mitzora, there is a period of tumah and a period of tara. What the Gemara is suggesting is like this, and it's fascinating. During his period of tumah, he's permitted in relations. During his period of tara, he's not permitted in his relations. The pasuk says over here, "V'yasha michutz li'olo shivas yamim." He has to sit outside of his tent for 7 days. She'aser b'tashmish shamita. Ultimately, during the purification process, tashmish shamita is aser. V'ein ohalo ein ishto. And Abba said the tent refers to one's wife. Shenemar leich emor lahem shuvu lachem li'alechem. By Matan Torah. After Matan Torah, Kadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe to tell the people to go back to their tents. And the tent ultimately again is a reference to one's wife. So therefore, Abba say, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara is saying over here is something absolutely amazing. That a mitzora muchlat, right, a confirmed mitzora, is permitted with relations with his wife during the days of Tumah, but not during his days of Tara. Rabbi Huda Omer, Shivas Yamim, Yisapulo. So the pasuk says that 7 days he's supposed to observe his Tara process, Yemei Sefiro velo Yemei Chiluto, which means he's prohibited ultimately again in relations, the days that he's counting his Tara, but not the days of his confirmed Tzaras. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Zayin Yemei Sefiro, Kal v'chomer li Yemei Chaluto. Rabbi Yossi Yehuda says, no. Of course, the same way that he's prohibited during the days of his purification, he's also prohibited in Tashmish Shamita during the days of the Tumah of his Tzaras. Shabbos say it's a fundamental machlokes. It's a fundamental machlokes. Is a mitzora muchlat permitted in Tashmish Shamita during the days of his Tumah? Danti lifnei Rebbe. I brought this up in front of Rebbe. Limaratan Rabbeinu. Rebbe, you taught us Yosam lo hayolo lo Uzio ela bimechi luto. Rabbi say Yosam was one of the kings of Yehuda, right? He conceived his son with his wife. So his son was Uzio, and it was, when you do the math, Yosam was a mitzora for a large part of his reign. It must have been that Uzio was conceived when Yosam was a mitzora. Amarlo, to which Rabbi said, Af ani kach amarti. I said the same thing, and therefore that's a proof that what? That halacha lamaisa, tashmish shamita is permitted ultimately with a mitzora who is a mitzora muchlat. So we'll have to stop over here. We're stopping mitzugya. Will the yahrtzeit get to the bottom of this and understand exactly the prohibitions and what is permitted for a mitzora muskar and a mitzora muchlat? And from that we'll see ultimately what a person with saras is permitted to do on chalamayid. We'll stop here.